We have to understand the overwhelming nature of most souls on earth, because it is the battle between good and evil, darkness and light within each and every soul on earth. That's just the nature of the beast. We have both extremes here. We have really, really evil souls, and we have really, really holy souls, and everything in between. We do actually end up battling good and evil inside of ourselves, outside of ourselves, in our physical lives on earth. And this happens in the mystical spheres as well. When they talk about fighting against principalities and powers of good and evil, that's literal. These exist. So we have the principalities and powers in the angelic kingdom. We have principalities and powers in the demonic kingdom. And these are real battles that will occur for our souls. And the way that these things occur is that we have to come face to face with our own darkness, our own false views, the things that we are either doing, thinking, or feeling that may be at odds with the truth. And what is the truth? The truth is God. And so if we want to find the truth, that's the measure of the truth. God is the measure. What is God? God is love. So we know this also from the mystical experiences, from all the near-death experiencers. That's what God is. But what is love? Love is a transformative energy. It is a vibration, a frequency that lifts a soul up into a higher stratosphere, so to speak. Love is not something that encourages a low vibration to stay in a low space, while love embraces us no matter where we may be in a spectrum. Love itself is transformation, and love will encourage the soul to move upwards. And that's what spiritual warfare will look like for us individually, is that we will be challenged to move upwards. And that means we have to take a look at everything we believe, think, see, and feel, and learn how to discern that which is good from evil, that which is inferior from superior, and actually make changes within and then without. And then the bigger aspects of spiritual warfare obviously go out into all manner of things, including the full-on battles that people will have against dark forces, all the way up to exorcism, where you see that these things can manifest in a variety of ways. A lot of times what people will experience when they first have out-of-body experiences, they're protected and they will see the beautiful things. They'll be taken, they will bypass, and they will go into the heavenly experiences. You'll see this in my writings as well. You'll go into the heavenly experiences, you'll see what's beautiful, you'll see your guardian angel, your spiritual guardians, and it will only come over a gradual time where there will come a point where it's like, okay, it's time now for you to learn about the dark side, for you to learn about good and evil. There can be a tendency for people who've had some experiences, especially for people who've had one or two, or they've had a near-death experience, one or two near-death experiences, or even people who've had a lot of experiences. Let's say they've had 100 experiences, or maybe even more, but they've never seen any of this. And they think that's like a sure sign none of this exists. Well, you're probably not going to be introduced to it until you've had 3,000 experiences. And you will only be introduced to that if you are actually called to know that and to be a part of it, or to work within the realms of spiritual warfare in that way, because we're not all called to the same things. So these were things that I was called to, and then to work in the realms of the heavens, the purgatories, and the hells with souls, which is all part of that spiritual warfare as well. So it's important for us to always remember, and for me too, because we only know what we have already seen. We don't know what we haven't seen. And we can get very arrogant about what we have seen in thinking that what we have seen covers the whole gamut, but it doesn't. The nature of the earth, there's a predatory nature here, and you see that in the animal kingdom. And then the level that we as humanity is supposed to be striving for is the will of love. So we're supposed to move from that predatory will, which is the karmic will, where we're all bumping off of each other. And there's fear that comes with spiritual warfare that's just natural to it. And it will get more and more intense as you go into the heavy duty, when you're really like battling with a demonic source. You're going to wake up terrified. Even if you're victorious, you're going to wake up and you're going to be freaked out by it, because part of what's happening is, and this is the part that's hard for people to understand, because of the fact that this is always going on, most people are not aware of it. What's happening is you're becoming aware of something that's already there. And I'll give you an example. Someone who shared this with me, a person in Australia who had a near-death experience. And when he came back from his near-death experience, he had this new spiritual gift of just being able to see the spiritual presences around people upon return. He said that when he came back and he was awake in the hospital, there were like 7 little demons just hanging out in a corner of his room. And he would watch the nurses walking down the hallway, and there would be 2 demons walking with each one of them. And he would see an occasional angel, but he was just shocked at how many demons walked among us. And they said, well, welcome to reality. And what I mean when I say that is, just because we can't see them doesn't mean that they're not already there. And so what this man had to learn to do was to come to terms with being aware of what already is, but what he now knew to be right there in front of him. And the basic structure of the universal sphere of realms, this understanding of how we have the lowest evil being the first realm, the second realm being dominant darkness, third and fourth realm being where we are, which is the third and fourth dimension, the mortal realms, the battles where good and evil take place. Realms 5 and up, which goes on into infinity, are the worlds of light, which continually radiate up to higher and higher frequencies of light. The basic structure of understanding that we do actually have these underworlds that reside below the veil of illusion, that are operating in darkness and evil. We also have the realms that we are in that reside in these battles between good and evil. We're basically that realm, ironically, the realms of discernment. It's the realms where we have to go from having dark thoughts, impure thoughts, thoughts that are just incorrect, and discerning our way to higher thinking. And that's what will get us into the 5th sphere. and that will take us to a higher place. But we have to actually do that work, which is difficult because we're surrounded by all of this stuff, which is mingling of good and evil here. We have stuff that comes in from the higher spheres, but we have all these delusions and beliefs and thought systems that come in from the first and second realm. And the general nature of souls that reside here is that they're in karmic delusion. They believe that they know the ultimate truth, and they don't. They're nowhere close. And how many times do people say, when they have an experience, I'm not really worthy of this, or I didn't earn this, or I must be special if this is happening. And some of that comes from not realizing that this has been happening from the beginning of time. And so it's new to them, but they're thinking that this only happens to chosen souls. They're not realizing, no, this means you're awakening, and that this is not a sign of predilection. This is a sign of you are awakening, and that this happens to all human beings when they are awakening. And don't get caught up in this idea. It's a vanity. It's a total vanity. And then literally a lot of people end up getting stuck right there. It's like, oh my gosh, I don't feel like I'm worthy, but and then they really just get caught up in this vanity moment, and they miss the whole point of the moment, which is whatever the message was that was brought to them, which they needed to process through to get to the next step. This isn't about whether or not you're special. This is about the message of the experience. Let's get back to that. And how many souls willing to take on a faith, but that's as far as it goes. So they don't actually enter into the battle of the soul. They do kind of become little helpless beings there. And people need to realize that there's more to it, that we do have to take it further. We have to go further. We can't just sit there at the entrance and say, do it for me. We have this idea that everything can be just done for us. We do have to participate in it. There's a saying that God can bring about your redemption without you, but he won't. And the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, from his mystical experiences as well, he talks a lot about how when we cross over, that our true alliances are immediately revealed. Whereas in the physical world, we can appear as one thing, even though inwardly we might be another. If you are like a brooding viper, you will appear as a brooding viper in the afterlife. If you are a gull demon, you will appear as a gull demon in the afterlife. This cover that we have in the physical world is taken from us in the afterlife. And so we are sent to where we're compatible after this life, not to what we may try to project to others as to what we are. And it is very important that we are honorable and true to ourselves and to this process. Who cares what other people think? We want to be standing in a good position with God, and that's an honest position. Even if it has to start out with, these are my vices, let's lay them out. Even if you are a brooding viper in the beginning, but being honest with yourself and being willing to stand in the rowboat with your own demons of your own commonness, and be willing to be honest with yourself so that you actually do what needs to be done to remedy that. Don't be afraid to look at it. Don't be freaked out when you see it, because we're all there in the same boat. And there's a book called A Wanderer in the Spirit Lands, which was put out by A. Farnese in the 1800s, which shows the journey of the soul from the lower hells until he reaches his redemption in the higher spheres. You see a similar pattern in this accounting, where as the soul is able to reach to a higher thrust, he reaches out for help, and help is sent. But it's literally incremental steps along the way. It's one incremental step, but it's happening. And of course, it's by steps. The old Taoist saying about it's by those water drops that the pitcher is eventually filled. There's also these other accountings in near-death experiences that people have shared. We have people who have had hellish experiences when they have near-death experiences, and they experience something similar where all of a sudden they're surrounded by a variety of different hellish things going on, and the only thing they can do is either get on their knees or roll over and ask for God to help them. And somehow they do. Literally, what these stories tell us, what Wander in the Spirit Lands tells us, and what my experience tells us, is the minute that happens, help is sent. Because the minute it happens in these near-death experiences, Jesus Christ is there. The angels show up. God the Father shows up in some of the experiences. It's immediate. In my experiences, it was literally the minute an aspiration is achieved in a soul, help is sent. That quickly. Despite how difficult that may seem, think about what we experience here. The minute one of us has a higher aspiration, the assistance that we receive, the unique synchronicities that occur that lead us to exactly what we need to do that or to make it happen or to bring it about, and sometimes even spiritual events that occur to bring it about. It happens all throughout creation. It doesn't just happen here. So it happens even in those lowest of hell realms, even in the purgatorial realms, just as we see it here. And without question, without exception, everyone I hear from says, I don't want to reincarnate again. I don't want to have to come back here. I know I don't want to come back here either, but it's all dependent on whether or not I fulfill everything I have to fulfill. The answer to that question then is really important, because if you don't want to come back again, then you can't choose the quick reward over the path that might require more work and might be more difficult, but might actually achieve liberation for you. But we can really compartmentalize ourselves and place ourselves within these boxes of concepts. And I'm definitely a person who embraces all religions and stuff, because I read the ancient sacred texts and I study them and write about them. But we do that in religion as well, where we lose the thrust of the original revelation, which is this grand out-of-body experience that was had by the prophet who brings it to us. We forget that what created that faith was something completely liquid, ethereal, non-structured. We try to shove it into a structure, and structures cannot contain God. A lot of times it blocks it. And one of the things that I've definitely learned over the years is that most souls do experience out-of-body travel while they're sleeping at night, even though most souls are not aware of it. But what happens is that other half of our existence here is where we are being taught and trained, and we are being given all these little shifts of frequency and vibration that's trying to help us through our daily life. It's again going back to what I mentioned earlier, which is we're just becoming conscious of what's already going on. Is it dangerous for me to go out of body? Well, you're already doing it. So you're kind of becoming aware that you're doing it. You're remembering that you're doing it, and becoming able to now see the principalities and powers that walk among us. It's not that they're not already there and haven't always been there. It's just that we become capable of seeing them, just like our near-death experiencer in Australia, whose life completely changes because he wakes up and can see what's always been there. And it's so helpful, I think, for anyone who's trying to think forward and walking in the movement, stepping in the movement, to realize there are all these easy pitfalls, and these pitfalls, they're everywhere. It's so simple to just, oh, okay, I don't have to do that. That's stupid. It's a waste of time. But the reality is purification is kind of difficult. I wouldn't say that it's overwhelmingly difficult, but it is hard to do it. It takes effort, and most of us would rather not deal with it. And we have to be willing to be shown what is true, regardless of what our previous view of reality might have been, whether it's the reality about God and our world, or the reality about our own soul, which is probably the harder part of seeing our own soul And the reason it's so important to be able to do that is because by allowing ourselves to see the energetic truth of ourselves and even of others, we accelerate that path by literally decades. Because otherwise you can literally spin and wander in place for decades on one issue over and over and over again. But if it's shown to you and you feel it energetically, you witness the energetic truth of it, you are much more likely to address it quickly and now. But there's all these little lines that I would hear in the spirit world from various angels and spiritual guardians throughout the years. And one of them I loved was from an angel who came up to me and said, "It's time to take a little walk in the movement today." It stuck with me and I remember it. And part of the reason why is because what is the movement? What do you think the movement is? In the spirit world, the movement is actually this moving spiritual ether. When you're being invited to take a walk in the movement, you're literally taking a walk. You're stepping into this moving ether. You're walking in the movement, which is going forward, and it's vital and it's life-giving and going forward towards God. How do you do that in a physical body when you can't see that energetic trail of movement? That's how you do it. Okay, so what would its opposite be then? If you can't take a walk in the movement, what is the opposite of that? And that's where the movement ceases. And people go through these ebbs and flows in the spiritual life, and people will go through these dry periods, but then you have to be moving towards that altering again back to the hunger. And when you become capable of altering realities in all worlds, and then it starts with your realm, and then you also move into other worlds, but it starts with the realm which you occupy, and then you get taken into more and more scenarios, but not just scenarios, but energies, bigger energies, individual circumstances that we get called into. You start getting called into what I call constructs, which have more to do with either larger events, larger regional or worldwide events, or even just energetic happenings in the mystical spheres that have no correlation with events. It's just something that has to be addressed. We talked about the energetic grid around the earth and how that had to be given some energy and balance. And we brought white light from Venus up towards it to try to give it a little more balance. So you start dealing with these types of things that are part of the realm that you occupy. I remember being taken into the energy of the LA riots before they happened in the 90s. And it was this big construct operation, a destruct construct, which is what it's called, where you're taking down an old construction that no longer works and creating a new construct where that used to be, to things where you are working on the energetic grid of the earth, or you are actually dealing with the demons in the air and actually battling some of those forces and having to try to work with getting some of them out of the realm. And we take that responsibility for everything that we shoot out there. We become more aware of this as we continue in the mystical spheres. We become more and more aware of the energy that we do put out towards other souls in every circumstance, every set of actions, every set of non-action. But the energetic truth behind our action always determines the actual validity of the interaction and the actual substance of the interaction. And it's actually, in God's eyes, more important than anything, because the intention is why we do something. And how many of us know that you can have the best of intentions and then you go forward and you do something and it doesn't turn out the way you think it should have, based on, gosh, my perfectly logical thinking told me this should turn out this way, and look what's happened instead. But God knows what our intentions were. And it's like, well, if I had known it would go this way, I might have tried something entirely different instead. But when our intentions were good, but we just didn't know better. And sometimes we do things with all good intentions and we do the right thing with good intentions and it still goes bad in the end. That happens too. And that's why our intentions are given such importance, because our intention is really the determination of where we stand in the evolutionary thrust, which is the altruism, the caring for our soul's well-being and the well-being of other souls. There is this continual desire for the betterment of all who interact with my path. And with the seed of humanity, it was so important to learn cause and effect. There is a tendency in the human realm to want to explain away cause and effect. And it really is that simple, that you know that in the physical realm, if you jump off a cliff, you will fall and you will get smashed and die. If you're in an astral realm, you can jump off a cliff and you might fly up into the astral sky, but you can't do that in a physical realm. The cause and effect of the physical realm is very simple. You can't do that or you die. And there are many forms of cause and effect in our world that we as human beings try to explain away, but we know that it's true. If you are energizing an action, then there are likely outcomes. And so we have all these things where we don't want to deal with the cause and effect of our own lustful desires, our own greed, our own desire to be noticed or get something that doesn't belong to us. Maybe it belongs to someone else and we know that, or someone else is more worthy of it and we just want it anyway. There's also a movement that goes backwards. Those who are energized towards evil are just as energized as those who are energized towards the light. And that's one of the difficulties, and this is important in spiritual warfare to delineate that, because they are energized by an actual force, and people can get really, really energized and they're going backwards and they're getting just as energized. And let's take it to a really nasty, gross evil like a serial killer. They can be extremely drawn into whatever obsession they might have, and the dark side will energize that pursuit just as strongly as God will energize a good, loving, godly pursuit. So you can see how when you're sitting there in that place of ceasing, where there is no energy moving and you're just circling, you could go either way. And you may not even realize it. We're, of course, using an extreme example there with a serial killer, but you may not even realize it when you start moving slowly into the backwards flow versus the forwards motion. And that can be so simple because especially if the discernment is not being developed. But I had a doctor, a physical therapist years ago who said, I wish we had a machine where my patients could just touch it and I could touch it and then I could feel what they feel. That's kind of what this is. We feel it and we understand it. We understand it as they understand it, but at the same simultaneous moment, we understand it as God understands it. So we can have this full spectrum of knowledge of exactly how they feel and why they feel the way they feel. Why are they so defeated in this? But also how God views it and what is the remedy according to God? What is the next thing that needs to happen for them that we can provide energetically that will push them in that other direction? And ironically here, this is so important because so many people, when they think of spiritual warfare, they don't think of this sort of thing, do they? They're thinking of this, I'm going to battle the demons. That is coming, but they don't realize that before you ever get to that, there is all of these subtleties, which without, you can never really be prepared for that. Because all of these things you have to understand first, and you have to be able to have that sensitivity and becoming life itself. Detaching from being so attached to my separate identity being so important. Who cares? And Fear and worry is huge in almost every aspect of the spiritual life. We'll see this with spiritual warfare. We'll see it with ghosts and lost souls. We see it with our own karmic paths, our own reincarnation journeys. We see it with almost everything that we will experience in the out-of-body travel state as we undergo purification. Will have an aspect of peeling away layers of fears, misunderstandings, worries, things that become fetters for us. In Buddhism, they call it fetters, things that hold us to earth, hold us down, keep us from moving forward. They just become something that's like a big tight shoelace. And we do individually choose. And that's what spiritual warfare is in essence. Choosing, what are we going to be? You're going to serve God or the dark side? We're going to serve creation or destruction. And so this is really, really a vital part of just even understanding the basic element of what spiritual warfare is, which is those two parameters. And it makes it really simple, because when you just break it down to that, then it's really easy to discern that what I'm thinking of doing is either destructive or creative. That's part of the very foundational practice now of, okay, now we know where we start this discernment that we have to form that foundation for creation or destruction. And everything that you choose, you put to that test. In reality, too, we often do not know for sure unless it is actually revealed to us energetically. And then, of course, there's a whole nother discerning process about whether or not we are having things revealed to us from the proper source. But these kinds of things can be very cloudy. There are things that we can learn to do in the physical level to make really good discernments. But in the essence, a lot of these things have to be revealed for us to truly know what is the energetic truth about that situation or that soul, because it's hidden to us. And there's a reason it's hidden to us. These are things that are reserved for God's eyes alone, unless He chooses to give us that light into it. But possession itself is very rare, actual possession. But there are these other parts of it, which include obsession. And that's when we are surrounded by, influenced by these demonic forces of our vice. So that which we are most attracted to, we attract those spiritual forces towards us. So if you're attracted to a virtue, the angels of virtue will be coming towards you. If you're attracted to a vice, those angels of that vice, those demons of that vice, they will also come towards you. We are literally giving permission for them to come near us. When we're having greedy thoughts, angry thoughts, we're giving permission for them to come into our sphere, into our perimeter. Those are the kinds of things that bring them about us. Most of us have this around us. Most of us do, and very few of us would likely recognize that we absolutely do. But you have to remind yourself, again, you're entering into an energetic reality. Most people, this will happen naturally if this is something they're called to do. And they're going to want guidance to it because they don't understand what's happening to them. If you're actively seeking it out, you're more likely to run into trouble than if you allow things to happen naturally. Because if things are happening naturally, it's usually more something that you're just being called in to do, you're being drawn to do it. And then there's a certain mystical protection that comes with that. It's a new experience for you, but okay, you went in and now you see I have to try to become conscious in that moment of I need to try to sit still so that I can be infused with the knowledge of why I'm here. And that's something that we become more better at as we continue, where we realize without being informed, we never understand what's happening. But once we get good at that, it makes a huge difference, because then everything comes together and makes sense and things just fall into place. This is part of evolution and creation, continuing to create, which is how we all work to help one another on all these different energy, vibration, and frequency levels, where we do help each other on these subconscious levels. And people do it, I'm sure, for me. I do it for other people. This is part of the mechanism of how we grow. And we do it not only by receiving help, but also by giving help. So it's both, it happens both ways. What we have to remember is that every one of the prophets, saints, mystics, sages, and ascetics from all traditions and religions and cultures, they had this final moment on earth, their final lifetime. This is where most of the ancient sacred texts come from. This is the final words of a realized soul before they leave this planet, leaving behind the keys, the secrets. What we all want to do is remember that even though it may not be our task to change the nature of this realm, if that is to change, then God will deign it, and he'll lead that charge and do it and tell us what to do if he wants us to assist. But for the meantime, if assuming that that's not the case, since I was told very clearly that at least so far that's not the case, then what we want to do is leave behind whatever we can that will help all those who follow to find their way out of here too. Find their way through the lessons to be learned in this earthly existence here, so that they can complete that purification journey and ascend out of this realm of learning into the next level. And that's really what the purpose of many of those prophets, saints, mystics, and sages and ascetics and the ancient sacred texts were trying to do, was to give those individual viewpoints of their path and how they achieved it, and moving on to the higher astral planets and into the higher worlds. To a certain extent, there is a point energetically in the alteration realms. We do have a sense when someone is at that point where it's okay, you have to just let them be. They've made that choice. They're going that way. They literally are going towards death, and death being a spiritual state, not necessarily a physical state. It can be both, and it can be just one or the other. Just like life is not necessarily a physical state, it can be either or both. And so when we're going towards life, we're going towards light, love, and goodness. When you're going towards darkness, you're going towards darkness, evil, and disarray and chaos. And so when someone chooses that, you let them choose it, because there is a point of no return. It doesn't mean that they can't return. It means that they've chosen not to return, and that it is pointless then to continue trying to alter their path. So you let them be until God decides and sends someone back in to assist. Because literally one of the other things I've been shown is the moment a soul reaches out for help, help is sent literally that second. It's amazing to see how quickly that happens. So the moment that soul is ready for help again and wants to go the other direction, that help will be there instantly. But when a soul is like, nope, this is where I'm going, we let them do that. Because what happens is, it's, you know, how people talk about having to hit rock bottom. Spiritually, it's the same thing. When you talk about energizing the upward thrust, a lot of the mystical work, a lot of spiritual warfare is doing these energetic things. And what you see in the mystical and the out-of-body travel states is how the angels, and then also how other souls like myself and others like me, and there are many others like me, and you'd be surprised how many of you who are watching might be doing this and not remember it yet. Because again, a lot of this is just remembering what's already happening, that we are doing things to assist souls subconsciously who are trying to go higher, but they have blocks along their path. We help them to remove those obstacles. And then the angels come in and they have this beautiful thing that they do where they just know, they're like little surgeons. They know, I need to tweak this, I need to tweak that, switch this and that. And then there's all of a sudden a light coming out this way and this way, which gives the soul a forward motion. And so they just have this beautiful, perfect synergy to know how to help us as souls to continually go in towards that upward thrust, as long as that's what we're seeking. But we also throw a lot of obstacles on our own paths, as we can all imagine. We all do it. I do it. Everyone does it. And so then there's also these alterations. There's a lot of damage control. We've lived so many different lifetimes, and we have loved many souls as mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, husbands, wives. And we do have certain souls that are very close to us, but it's not that simple. That the way that we do it in the physical world, where we try to compartmentalize love in the way that we experience it in the afterlife, the love that God emanates towards us, that near-death experiencers feel, is different than what we call love here. And so this is something that I was experiencing, was that universal love that souls have for each other who have been working to help each other to evolve over lifetimes feel. And it was a very uncomfortable feeling, but ironically, it relates back to spiritual warfare, in that, how do we deal with spiritual warfare? We go back to, well, who is God? God is love. And so we have to come to terms with what is love really in terms of God. But then we also have to come to terms with what love is in our own life, but in our soul, and understanding it in this bigger sense. And recognizing that this is not something that has to be a conflict for people, that we do have many lives, and that there are these connections that we have that will crop up for different reasons. But there's something mysterious about it as well. There is something important about us becoming awake in this physical vessel. It's interesting. I remember having a conversation via email with Dr. Rudy Shield, who's the astrophysicist from Harvard, who spoke about how they had started realizing that everything in astrophysics was leading to this whole thing of consciousness realizing itself, and that everything, all these particles and stuff, was all leading towards physical life, and then consciousness realizing itself through physical life. And he also talked about how you could see this moral law written into quantum physics, which I thought was fascinating. He talked about that. And in what I've seen in the mystical as well, is that there is something very deeply important about a soul realizing truth in the conscious waking state physically. Because when we cross over and go to the other side, we very often go through period where we do have these awakenings. So you got to say, why does it matter that we have it there or have it here? We have to incarnate it. We have to bring heaven to earth. There is something about embodying it in its totality. And so we have to bring it to physical consciousness. And so a lot of what I would see in these alterations was that it was more important that someone have an awareness, a realization, than whether or not they survived whatever act they were in the middle of committing or doing. And there were only a few of these situations like this where people really did die en masse or whatever. Most of the time they weren't situations like that, but it was more important that they changed their mind. It happened in a situation with a gang member who had to leave the gang, knowing that he might not end up living very long as a result. And he did end up getting murdered by the gang very shortly thereafter. But he had this perceptual change, which was pivotal for his soul while he was physically alive. There was also more than one Civil War soldier who had this beautiful, long drawn out thing. He was a Confederate soldier. I was able to take him into listening into conversations with some of the Union soldiers, and he started realizing these guys weren't very different from him. And so he snuck out of his camp that night because he didn't want to participate in this war of killing his brothers in arms. So he was trying to go north, and he ended up getting killed by a Union soldier because the Union soldier that he came across didn't believe that any Confederate deserved to live. The Union soldier did not know his heart, but had that perceptual change before he died. And so these were some of these instances where people had these perceptual changes, but they still died. But them dying was not the important event. The perceptual change was more important than anything, because it is those moments of awakening to the next level of understanding that are so important to the soul. That's what brings us ever closer and closer to God. But when you're seeking it out, trying to make it happen yourself versus allowing it to just come upon you, because it happens very naturally if you are called to it, if you just kind of surrender and let it happen. If you try to make it happen, it's a very different thing, and then you're susceptible to all sorts of invasions and other types of problems. It's difficult enough if you're doing it in conjunction with this unfolding mystical training that occurs when you're just being asked to do it. You're literally just being utilized. And you know what's interesting about it too, just having the hindsight of 37 years later, is how interesting it is that God uses souls to do these things, because there is this give and take that goes on, this benefiting and receiving, this exchange that we have with one another on earth. I believe, yes, if God wanted it to be so, he wouldn't need me to be there in the middle. But for some reason, God wants it to be so. And I think the reason, part of the reason, the very grounded, limited reason that I as a human being can come up with, is that it's important for us to be involved in one another's evolution. It's important for us to be instruments to one another. We receive, but we also give. But in the real bottom line reality, this is where we can all be very ultimately quite humble, because we're not doing anything except receiving and being open and receptive to do what it is we are instructed to be a vehicle for. But God, for some reason, has ordained that this is the way it needs to happen. And I believe that this is in part because it is really important for all of us to be a part of evolution in progress. For everyone, not just ourselves, because this does change our journey too. By understanding the journey of others, it completely alters our own. And it's so important, because otherwise I think we could become very, very self-focused, and we wouldn't have this expanded understanding and this view. I remember very clearly a few times I was told it's not your job to be understood, but to be understanding. It's important for us to learn how to understand others, and to understand that we don't understand everything, and that other people go through experiences that we don't always understand right off the bat. This humility that's required of our humanity, to love one another and have compassion for one another, and try to be vessels for one another of love and compassion during this journey we all take. And that without that bigger picture, I think that so much would be lost of the spiritual journey. And looking at ourselves alone, I don't know if you can see where I'm going with that, but we would become very self-centered. And I think that's part of the reason God does it differently than we might think. We think we're helping them, but in reality, what we are always trying to do in the spiritual when we are in the physical body is to become capable of understanding more and more within the one vessel. When you go through the whole ritual passage, the initiations, the rites, one of the things that happens is all of your past lifetimes come in through your higher self, and the knowledge of those lifetimes comes into you. Whatever information you've gained from those lifetimes comes into you. And part of the purpose of that is that we want to have this ability to see through many, many different eyes, not just through this one little limited tiny point of view. So the more that a soul does not awaken to this perceptual shift, the more tiny they are, the more isolated they are, the further away from oneness they are, the further away they are from understanding, which is trying to understand their fellow human beings. There are so many things that we see in our world that could easily be resolved if more souls were able to compassionate and try to understand that our individual views are not the only view, and that it's actually a gift to be able to see through the eyes of others, and that it's a good thing to be able to do that, even if you disagree with whatever their conclusions might be, but to be able to do that. What you're trying to do, you're becoming more of a multiplicity, rather than just this one tiny little dot of existence that has this one little viewpoint that's very limited and very shallow, and it has a limited ability to then go beyond itself. As soon as that soul starts taking on a perceptual shift here, then it starts widening, getting bigger. And then you start bringing in these remembrances of your other lifetimes. It gets bigger. And then you start becoming able to put yourselves in other people's shoes. You're able to have compassion. You're able to understand where other people might be coming from. Even if you may not necessarily always agree with them, you can understand them. This is very important in the spiritual understanding and awakening. And it's simply because in the end, we are all a divided unity. We are all one and the same thing. And so all these parts and parcels are parts of ourselves that we're all trying to understand. And so this ability to understand one another really does come back to understanding ourselves as well, because we cannot understand ourselves if we cannot understand others, because others are ourselves. So many people think that they're so helpless, but one of the things I have seen over and over again is how powerful each and every individual soul who cares can be. It's so hard to really capture it in words, but everyone who wishes to serve that light and serve life and push towards that, remember, because it is very true that one soul has so much power, especially when it's a soul filled with love or caring, or even just the divine focus to right the path for all. Individual souls, even if you feel like you're the only one, it's okay to be the only one. You may be the only one. If you're the only one, if we've got one, that's good. You'd be so surprised how much can be accomplished with one caring soul, one soul who is in it to win it for God. It's amazing. But here we're back at Spiritual Warfare 101, which is you want to figure out what is the best use of the energy. So if you're developing into a spiritual warrior, it's not the best use of the energy to sacrifice a spiritual warrior. The best use of the energy is to de-energize and de-escalate the situation if possible. But the natural thinking on my part was, oh, I'll just stand in front. And then literally what happens over time, you do take hits with spiritual warfare, and it does impact you both spiritually and physically over time. Especially it can even more so depending on what kind of battles you get into and how badly you get beat. The goal is not to just sacrifice yourself if at all possible. The goal is to become more and more energized so that you can actually be in the field for a long time before you're put out to pasture. And many of us are not able to do this our entire adult lives. We might have a good 10 or 20 years in us before we might be too tired to do it at the level that we do it. And so we're looking for getting the most bang for our buck. So you want to look at how you deflect a situation rather than just taking it in. It's almost like the easy solution is to just jump in front of a speeding car or a speeding bullet, rather than how do I redirect that so that no one gets hurt. And we can, because of our own view about ourselves, I'd like people to really think about this because it really applies to all social issues, and it applies to just about every human being, because it really doesn't matter what it is. Everybody has something really that they think that people would throw rocks at them about. Whether it's they're too white, they're too black, or I'm too stupid, I'm too smart, I'm a sinner. I mean, really, isn't that the bottom line? Because it's all of the above that's included in that. And so whatever it is, whatever your vice might be, I didn't handle my finances well, I have lust, I've done this, I've done that, whatever. So everyone's got it, whether it's someone who's gay or someone who's not, someone who just decided never to get married and never had kids. I've had people tell me they feel guilty their whole lives for not having children. It's like, really? But everyone has something they think they should have stones thrown at them for. This is really important. And I think one of the interesting things about being the writer and having been in the position of receiving emails and hearing from people has been this insight that I've had into realizing how similar we all are, where we all think that we're off cowering in the corner with our own little secret vice or our own little secret sin or our own secret little, oh, I'm not good enough. Everyone thinks they're not good enough to have these mystical experiences. Everyone thinks that. And it's like, what does that have to do with it? Literally, what does that have to do with it? It has nothing to do with it, because this is something we're all already doing. It's literally a process of becoming conscious of what we're all already doing. It's nothing to do with whether or not we're worthy of it, because our very existence is a gift from God. Everything that we have is a gift from God. There's nothing that we have to do to make ourselves more worthy or that makes us less worthy. We just are. So therefore, God is always reaching to us because He created us. Just like you do with your own kids, right? We all do that as parents. For those of us who are parents, we know we just reach to our children. And they might reach to us in some pretty unusual and strange ways at times, but we keep reaching back, don't we? But there's a lot of different ways that in my out-of-body travels where I'm called to give service to other people, but every time you're giving service to other people, you learn about yourself. There's nothing that you experience that doesn't open windows to your own soul and humanity as a whole. And, obviously understanding humanity opens bare humanity for yourself, because we are all just part and parcels of that. But a real basic alteration, and that's what we start with, an energetic alteration, which is how we're called to go in and change the outcome of something that could go wrong. And you're observing from what I call management realm, which is where things are happening before they hit the ground. And so that's where things are in thought and energy. And it's where things are happening before and where they're building up and they're going to hit the ground, but they haven't hit yet. When you're in the management realm, and if you're called in there to alter as an alterer, you're given this special gift of the Holy Spirit when you're called to do this. And one of the things that's real interesting about these experiences is you only know these things when God calls you to do so. I couldn't just say, okay, I'm going to go in and I want to know the truth about this or that. And it just happens unless God decides He's going to show you something. You're shown when you are being called to do something. So you have this ability at those moments when there is something that you are called to do. energetically, it's infused into you. It comes into you like a frequency of vibration. You know what's going to happen. And you know, too, at the same time, exactly what you need to do or say to intervene to alter it. You can have two forces competing against each other. Happened in a situation where the father was drunk, was probably going to really badly beat the child. He was so pissed off. So here's God trying to bring in that universal acceptance and love. And he's got this rage fueling. And I'm sure at the same time, there's probably the demons of rage trying to get him to really go for it, right? And so that's the battle right there, the spiritual warfare between what is he going to choose. And in this instance, he was able to respond to this love and this unconditional acceptance, and it calmed him. He was able to see that this was funny, that it really didn't have to be so serious. And he was able to see that he loved his child, and it diffused. But you can also see if he went the other way, the outcome could have been very, very different, and how the dark side would have very much liked that other outcome. And that is what the dark side would have energized. If they had been successful, that would have been their wish. And this is where you can see how a simple situation like this can literally be life altering. It can completely change the course of a soul's journey, a soul's history, can change the course of their life, obviously, because the consequences could have been extremely dramatic one way or the other. When you think about cases where children lose their lives over a momentary lapse of reason. And that is what the dark side grabs a hold of within us. An experience, I remember that I was challenging the Christians on the ground to stand because they weren't willing to fight to protect, and the darkness was taking over and control. And that's what we often have. And part of the reason we have it, first of all, you have to understand the nature of darkness. So we'll start there real quick. Nature of darkness is where they will take advantage of any boundaries that are left unguarded. They will try to manipulate, take over, control, take charge. If they can get away with something, they will do it. That's the nature of evil. Where damage can be done, it will be done. The nature of light is to try to work actually in harmony and dominion and love and kindness and peace. And so one of the mistakes and one of the weaknesses of the light can be that they go into this denial that darkness and evil are what they are. And so they don't want to or recognize the need to defend the boundaries of light. They think that, oh no, we'll be able to work this out without, and they don't recognize that no, you actually do have to stand. And you do have to put up those boundaries. You do have to have law and order. You do have to have a remedy in your social system for putting people into some kind of situation where you protect society against them when they have proven that they are not safe with other people. So in other words, prisons, jails, situations like that. You do have to have law enforcement. What happens is we've developed this idea that you can just rely on or count on other people to do the quote unquote right thing, when we actually have a whole society now of people who don't even know what the right thing is anymore. And that's partly because we've lost the whole idea of what is good, what is evil, and how do you actually discern those things. That is one of the biggest weaknesses of the light, is not realizing that no, the darkness, evil does not think like good thinks. Good does think about, well, what's best for everybody. Darkness thinks about what can I get away with, and does that very consistently, because it's not that much different than raising children. If we don't consistently give boundaries and clear definitions of what is acceptable behavior, children by their very nature will lack boundaries. We have to create that. And as a society, we have to create the boundaries as well. And if we don't have a clear boundary, then all havoc breaks loose. And there is no free destruction. Because everything that is done out of destruction is at someone's expense, whether it's something as minimal as, and that's not even minimal, but let's talk about vandalism or something like that. You're talking about there's a massive cost to the person who's been victimized by it. But then we're also talking about people making social statements by destroying entire cities, rioting, or shootings, where somehow the death of innocence makes something okay. No, that just isn't, that's just evil. It's just evil. And our perception of what death is very limited. We think of death, we think of it as the end of our physical life on earth. And that is the very grounded version of what death is. A lot of people have a lot of fear of that. And part of that fear comes from the fact that because of this forgetfulness that we are given as we enter into this life, people don't remember that we are literally just a blink of an eye into this reality, a blink of an eye into the next, and that these things are just moments in eternal time. So death is another blink, and you blink and you're elsewhere. But think about what death really is, because physical death is not what death as the concept is. Because again, now let's go back to what we've talked about in terms of spiritual warfare and the terms of discernment. It's creation, destruction, moving forward versus moving backward. I did want to point something out about backwards and forwards. You know how people say, gosh, it just seems like everything's so backward. People say that for a reason, because there's like an unconscious awareness that things are going backwards. It's not correct. It's not moving in a forward direction. So now we're looking at life and death, creation, destruction, forwards and backwards, life and death. So several things. Life and death are a presence and an absence of caring, a presence and an absence of feeling, a presence and an absence of vitality. And so when you look at these elements, how many people do all of us know? And many of us might have to take a look at ourselves as well and say, how many people do we know who are actually dead right now? And so then what does that force us to look at in terms of what does that mean for us if we wish to go forward, if we are residing in a death-like state? Which is kind of like giving up, having given up, and you just stopped feeling, stopped caring, stopped doing, stopped seeking, and then you've just stopped. And this is not an uncommon place to be for human beings. Human beings are very comfortable there. It's a really nice place to kind of just hang out, and it's very comfortable because you don't have to do anything. It gives you the freedom to not strive. And we all get tired, we all get exhausted. Striving and doing all the things that push us forward can be difficult. And so it's easier to just enter into death. An experience I remember actually showing me at a point of an actual physical death in my own past lifetimes was actually forcing me to deal with the concept of death of the spirit, showing that there's more to death than just death of the body. There is a death of the soul. This is now showing us that death is much bigger because, again, if you go back to at the very beginning of my journey, I had to make a choice of life or death, and I had to choose life. And that's choosing to go forward. That's choosing creation versus destruction. That's choosing evolution versus standing still or going backwards. So all of these things are coming together now in this understanding of life and death. What does life and choosing life versus death actually mean now? Choosing life means you have to feel, you have to care, you have to have vitality. How do you have vitality? The spirit has to be moving within you. And so if that is no longer the case, you are living in a living death. And a living death can be anything from complete and utter ignorance or utter disregard to even just simply doing the same thing over and over and over again just because it's comfortable. You can be living in a way where you follow a series of rituals that you're told are good enough, and that makes you feel like that's good enough, I'm good, and I'm going to do all the things I want. But I do this, let's say I go to church on Sunday and I pay my tithing, or I do this, or if I'm of another faith, I go to the mosque or the synagogue, and that's enough. I don't have to do more. I'm comfortable there. It doesn't require me to strive. There was also a situation with Daniel Pierce. What did Daniel Pierce not do? He didn't question. He didn't do the thinking. He didn't require anything more of himself than following along. This is a really important and profound realization, but it's also kind of overwhelming and sometimes scary for us. It seems so simple, but it can be overwhelming and scary. Why? Because what this tells us is that we might not be doing enough. There might be more required of us to strive more, to question more, to really go through the process that is placed in front of us, to try harder to understand our fellow human beings, to try harder to love, to give, to be something more, to create movement. I mentioned before that it's such a blessing that I've had to be able to receive emails from people after having written these things, because it gives me this insight into how similar all of us are. Another thing that it's given me insight into is just that the ancient sacred texts do this as well. We are sharing this planet, this reality, this physical classroom because we are much more similar than we'd like to admit or realize. And what I've learned, which I think is extremely freeing, it like takes a boulder off your back, is that when you start recognizing we're all here doing kind of the same thing, the purification process becomes much simpler, because you don't feel like, oh, look, I don't want anyone to notice. Gosh, I struggle with lust or greed. It's like, oh, yeah, I do too. Okay, so I need to recognize that and figure out how I'm going to overcome it. You become much quicker to say, okay, I see it. I need to address it. And you don't feel like you have this deep, dark secret about yourself. You are able to recognize, no, I'm just one of everyone. And one of everyone, I'm going to actually do something about it, because I don't want to keep coming back here and just doing it over and over and over and over again, which is what we are all doing. If you are incarnate here, then you can deduce from that that you are doing that. It's why we're here. Here you go. The ancient sacred texts, these are the masters. If you read the ancient sacred texts, you will find that they all had them too. The difference between the great masters and us is that they never gave up on overcoming, understanding, and trying to walk in the movement and go beyond those vices and go higher, so that they could go into the next level when they left here. The nature of the earth, there's a predatory nature here, and you see that in the animal kingdom. And then the level that we as humanity is supposed to be striving for is the will of love. So we're supposed to move from that predatory will, which is the karmic will, where we're all bumping off of each other and kind of living off of each other and kind of causing a little damage here and there, to the will of love, which is working in harmony for one another. That's kind of the gamut of the evolution that needs to take place in this realm. You have to go from the predatory will to the will of love. So that's our little guideline for what we need to do to move forward when we leave this place. Whether it's this lifetime and you just do it over and over again, or you do it from lifetime to lifetime, which is what most of us are doing. That's why we're here. And karmic retribution is when the energy of our actions comes back to us in one shape or form. This can actually be compared as well to the doctrines that you see in Christianity, Catholicism. Understanding, we've talked about several things that you can understand, even just from a Christian perspective. We talked about how you have these alterations of dark energies around a person. When you talk about a person going to confession or Catholic confession, the grace of going to a Catholic confession is basically the same thing, where the removal of that energy around your sins, the forgiveness of our sins, the burdens off of our backs are being removed. Now, another interesting thing about the theology around confession can remove the guilt of sin. We can be forgiven for sin, but it can't remove the temporal punishment due to sin, which is the karmic retribution, which is the consequences of whatever actions we've set in motion. So you can go and receive forgiveness for something you've done, but that doesn't necessarily change the outcome of whatever the actions are that have already been set in motion. These things all actually work and move very clearly with Christianity and the idea of the forgiveness of our sins by confession, whether it's the Catholic confession to a priest or confession directly to God in the Protestant tradition, and the understanding of how confession cleans your slate. That's what happens in an alteration of the dark energies around us. And so what you're seeing here is actually, well, what is the mechanism of how that happens? Well, this is part of the mechanism of how that happens, alteration. But there is also the other mysteries that are attached to it. But we cannot minimize the graces that are associated with certain acts that we engage in. So whether it's confession directly to God or going to confession in a Catholic church, there are graces associated with that. So like if you're thinking, okay, well, gosh, I'd really like to have the dark energies removed from around me. How do I bring an altar in to do that? Well, you start by confessing to God yourself, because the grace is actually already built into the act of that confession. You see, so there are other actions that we can engage in that bring about these types of graces that don't require us to actually have an alteration come in and do it in that way. People fast, and fasting has certain graces associated with it, which I've seen mystically. I've seen how these graces actually do work in those ways. There are other means and ways. A lot of times with alteration, it's going to be on people who are unconscious of the help that they're receiving. And spiritual warfare is a real battle, and it's a real battle within you. Don't for any minute think that this is or was easy for me, or that it was just like, oh yeah, no big thing. It wasn't like that. There were things that were hitting, and it would be, but for the grace of God, I could have been deceived by this or that. I could have seen it incorrectly. This is where the grace of God comes in, and you have that infused knowledge so that you know it's a temptation. But then, so what would have happened if I had fallen on something more slight shortly before? Would I have not had that infused knowledge at that moment when I really needed it? There's just this real humility of realizing that we stand on one thing only, and that's God's grace. None of this is earned by me. None of this did I do. This is all because God propped me up, and he showed me how to do it, and he walked me every step of the way. And so literally, God did this despite me. And that's what's so humbling. And I think we all have to remember this, because so many people, they think it's something that only happens to saints, or they think it's something that's beyond their strength and it would never happen to them. This is the journey of the common man. This is the journey of every man. And it can happen to all souls. And I hear from so many readers who are going through the exact same processes, the exact same kinds of temptations, different variations. It is the grace of God that carries us through, because God is the one who shows us how we're going to get through it. Here is, you're seeing the process of the humility being born. As you're going through these things, you're realizing just how weak you are and how easy it would be for you to fall to the simplest of stupid things. And this is where humility is birthed, is that you learn that none of us are above this. None of us are some strength-bearing paragon. We can be, in a momentary lapse, can be deceived into something we can totally not intend. How many times does that actually happen to a lot of people in life, where a momentary lapse leads to something they totally did not intend, and then they have to come up with the solution to how do they get out of it? How do they fix it? It's so hard to put it into words. Even just reliving these experiences, it plunges me back to that humility of remembering what it was like. Because it's not like you remember these and you're like, wow, I'm so glad I whipped his butt. It's like, oh my God, thank God I got through that. It's like, dang, that was a close call. It could have gone either way. And it's easier to understand that coming from the standpoint that I have of having been to even lower spheres and seeing the function of those spheres. And again, it's the same thing, respecting the function of that function of knowledge, that these different phases of knowledge that have to be in place, and that there is this system put in place for a reason, because we have to have a delineation for the protection of all souls and the evolution of all souls. And I don't see that many other writers talk about this issue, and Francisco Candido Javier wrote about it in his series on Life in the Spirit series, and he starts with Nosso Lar as the first book, which means Astral City in Brazilian. There's 12 volumes, and he talks about why it's so important that there are these barriers between these different kinds of realms. And it's because if there isn't, then all chaos would break loose, even in the higher spheres. You can't allow things that are incompatible to things that are evil and dark into like realms 5 and above, because that would literally be allowing hell to reign in the heavens. And what happens is, in the mystical, if you try to go to a realm that is higher than your level of compatibility, you literally feel like you're being crushed, because you have to be at the frequency and vibration required to enter into those different higher levels of spheres. And that's why you're constantly going through vibrational raisings, so that you can go higher and higher and higher and higher. So if you try to go there, you're going to feel like you're being crushed. You're not comfortable. You've been trying to enter. And I was shown that so I would see it's not like you're just being denied entry, is that you have to become compatible. You can't even enter here. You literally will be crushed. What we have to understand then is that there has to be a boundary between the hells and the purgatories and even the borderlands where we reside here, the mortal worlds, and the heavenly realms above. There has to be. Otherwise, there would be no order in the universe. There's a temptation, probably, especially because we see this especially so much in today's day and age in our mortal world, where it's like, no, everything goes. You have to accept everything. And so therefore, we should throw that idea, which is actually a karmic delusion, we should throw that idea onto God and onto the heavenly realms, when in fact that has nothing to do with eternal principles or eternal law. That's just a stupid karmic delusion that people come up with. It's their opinion, because they're like, okay, I want to be inclusive. I want to be able to sit on my couch over here. I don't want to have to move. I don't want to have to walk in the movement. I want to be able to feel comfortable saying I'm not going to do anything. So therefore everything goes, everything's fine. So that's what is kind of like the norm here. But that is not eternal truth. That is not the eternal principles which reign or operate in the mystical spheres. In the mystical spheres, there are very specific criteria that we all must meet to be compatible to different realms. Even if you're going to be a spiritual warrior, you have to meet specific criteria to go down to work in these lower realms, in the purgatorial realms and hell realms. You have to meet criteria to do that. One of the criteria, you want to know what the criteria is? One of the criteria that people don't think of is that you have to get to a point, and you do this through the mystical training, which is this stuff that I'm talking about, which is this humility that is birthed within you when you recognize yourself in all other beings. It's this ability into any situation, and you literally very sincerely, it's not that you just say it, it's that you literally embody a lack of judgment towards the souls that you minister to, that you literally just sincerely want to offer assistance, and that you are able to do that. But we absolutely do leave energetic footsteps. And it's a really important point, because people think that there has to be something bigger than that. Here's the thing. Where did all of this start? Think of the Zen aphorisms. They came from these little cute old men who lived in the mountains, who maybe jotted down, this 3-line thing, and it's been preserved, for thousands of years, because literally a lot of the original Zen aphorisms are individual aphorisms from a lot of different hermits in the mountains who were these Zen masters. We have some of the great ones that were known for founding Zen and all that stuff, but what you really have are the practitioners, the ones who just lived it. And then you'll see some of the greatest gems are just these random thoughts that were jotted down by some of those people. And what it shows is we put a lot of emphasis, because we live in a society, in a world where having some kind of a legacy after we're gone is so important, I guess. But the reality is that the legacy we leave is the love we place in other people's hearts. And love is an energy. And so that legacy can be as big as what you give to your family, and as small as the smile you give to someone at the grocery store. It's all those acts of love. It can be the moment in traffic where you respond to the deadlock in a loving way instead screaming out expletives. It's all the times that we, instead of throwing something negative out in the universe, we choose to throw something loving out. It's when you see someone who's dejected and you smile at them. When you have these chance meetings and you have your 5 minutes and something was exchanged there. Sometimes it's not even something that is visible or something that was in words. Sometimes it's totally energy. Sometimes just what somebody picks up from you. And we have to come face to face with our own darkness, our own false views, the things that we are either doing, thinking, or feeling that may be at odds with the truth, because it is the battle between good and evil, darkness and light within each and every soul on earth. And that's just the nature of the beast.